Alright, welcome back. In this video, we'll create a simple URL shortener application using Flask. This will make use of important concepts within Flask such as variable routing, as well as using WTForms to make a simple form to validate the user input. Before we get started, make sure you have Flask installed, and you can do this by going to the command prompt and using the command pip install Flask. And we will also need to install WTForms for Flask, which you can do using the command pip install flask-wtf. Alright, and before we start, you can find the HTML code in the description below. This is just the styling and the layout of our website. I've included the styling in the HTML file as well. This is just to make it a little bit easier to work with. So to start, we can first import Flask from Flask. We will then also need to create our application by creating a new instance. We will also need to specify the name so that Flask knows where to look for things like the template folder. Once that's done, we will create a default route, which is the route for our home page. And we do this using a Python decorator. I will do it like so, and underneath this, I will create a function that will return whatever I want to display for this particular route. In this case, I will want to render the template that I have here. So I can do this by importing render template. And then within the render template, I can specify the argument as the template I want to use. In this case, I want to use index.html. Note that I do not need to specify template/index.html because Flask will automatically look inside my templates folder, which is why you must make sure that you have the index.html file within your templates folder. I will then run my application only if this Python script is being executed directly, which is what this if name equals main if statement represents. And I'll run it by using the .run method, and I'll set debug equals to true. So if we run our application now, we can see that once we click on the link, we have a simple HTML website with just the title. We will add the input next. To create the input fields, we will be using WTForms. And to do so, we usually first want to create a separate file. I will just call it input_form.py. And I will first import Flask form from flask_wtf. And I will also import a string field and a submit button to allow us to create those elements on our web page. And just take note that those are imported from the WTForms package. I will then create a class called input form, and it will inherit from Flask form. Within that, I will create a input field for the URL and a button to submit the form. We will need to specify a label. In our application, we will not use this label, so it doesn't matter what we specify it as, but I'll just specify the label as URL. And for the submit field, the label will be the text of our button, so name the label as shorten. Now, besides just creating the input fields, we can also specify what validation we want for these input fields. And to specify the validators, we can specify within a list. There are quite a few validators that we can use, and you can create your own ones. I'll link below the documentation so that you can check all of them out. But in our case, I just want to use the validators to validate if it is a URL and the user has entered something within the input field. And we can do that by going to WTForms validators and importing URL and data required. We can then specify them as validators by putting them inside the list, and we need to make sure to initialize both of them. Within the validators, you can also specify a message if it is invalid, but in my case, I'll just leave it blank, and you'll see why in a moment. And now within our main application, we'll import the form. And then we will create a new instance of the form when the home route has been requested. And we'll also specify it as a keyword argument when rendering our template. What this allows us to do now is that we can access the form object that we have created within our HTML template. And now within our HTML template, we can use the different parts of our form object. In particular, we will first use the input element that was created, and we can do this by first writing two brackets. This is to tell Flask that this is something that we want to display to the user, and then I'll use the URL input element that was created within our input form. And I also want to customize this URL input element, and we can do that by giving it a class. I have already created the necessary styling here within the CSS, so we just need to specify which class it needs to use. And we can specify by using the keyword argument, which is class underscore, there's an underscore at the end, since class is a reserved keyword, meaning it is used for something else already within Python. And the class I've created for this is URL input. And we'll also do something similar for the submit button. This time I want to use the submit element that has been created. And the class that I've created for this is submit. And before we continue, something that we must do when we are working with WTForms is that we must specify a secret key within our Flask application. This is to prevent cross-site request forgery, which I will leave a link to read up more if you're interested on what it is about, but it really isn't necessary in our small application, but it is something that WTForms requires. So to do that, we will use app.config and we'll specify a key or secret key to configure it, and we can assign it to a value of a secret key. This secret key can really be anything. Just make sure that it is not revealed to anybody. And I'll just use this, which I created just using a password generator. Once that's done, we will need to use form.hidden tag within our HTML page. And if we reload the application now, we can see that the input elements are not styled correctly, and that's because I used the wrong class names. It actually should be URL-input and URL-submit. So if we refresh our application again, we now have the input elements like we saw earlier that we wanted, and the styles have been applied correctly. So now we will work on actually receiving the input from the input fields, and we can do that within this function over here. Now if we try to submit data using the form on our application, we can see that it says method not allowed, and that's because the form uses the post request to submit the data. But our current home route does not allow the post request. It only allows the user to use a GET request to receive the HTML files. So to allow the user to post data within this particular route, we need to specify a keyword argument like so. We will specify both GET and post so that the user can both receive the web page information, and they can also post form data to this particular route. So if we refresh our application here, we can see that if we click on this button now, it works as expected. Obviously, it doesn't actually do anything since we have not done anything with that form, but that's what we will work on now. So we will first want to check if the request that was given is a post request, and we can do that by first also importing the request variable from Flask. And we can check which HTTP method it is using request.method. And if it is a post method, we can then validate the form. And we can do that by using the validate on submit method. So if it is a post request and the form is valid, we would then want to shorten the URL here. For now, I'll just print out what the user has entered to the terminal so that we can both see how this works. And we can get what the user has entered using the data attribute. And if it is a post method but it is not valid, then I'll print a failed to the terminal. So if we see our application here, if I click shorten, we can see that our Flask server did receive it. But if I enter something invalid, for example, and we can see that now it is a post method, but the form validation has failed. Now that we're able to receive the form input data, what I want to do is to be able to store it, and I also want to create a unique ID that refers to that particular URL, so that when someone visits that route with that ID, we can then redirect them to the website that they have specified. And to store that information, you would usually want to use a database, but just to keep this application simple and to be able to focus on using Flask. So how I store this information is as a list of dictionaries, each dictionary containing both the ID and the destination URL that the user has entered. And what we can then do with this is that once a user requests a particular route, for example /1234, we can then look up within this list and see which destination URL they are trying to be redirected to, and then we can do that redirection. So I'll first create a variable for the destination URL, and that is whatever the user has input. I will then create a unique ID. And to create a unique ID, there are quite a lot of ways. Probably the easiest one, just to get our application running, will be to import the secrets module, which is built in and comes packaged when you install Python. Quite a few methods here that allows us to generate secret keys, but for our purposes, we will want to use the token underscore URL save. And within this method, we can specify the number of bytes that the string of characters should have. And then it will generate a random string like this. In our case, since we just wanted to give it a shot, we just generate a string of random characters with 8 bytes. I will then append to this list of shortened URLs the destination URL as well as the ID associated with it. And so if we save it now and we check our application, we can see that it has posted the data, but there's no indication to the user at all. And so what we'll do is we'll first clear the input field before we render the template, and then we will show the success message. To clear the input field, we can set the form.url input data to an empty string. We will then also want to create a temporary message that shows within our HTML page. That is what I've created this success message classes for. And to do that, we will use a feature within Flask called Flash Messages. This allows us to create temporary messages within our HTML page to give the user some feedback. And within this message, we will then give them the link that has been shortened. And so to do it, we first need to import Flash. And within the Flash method, there are a few parameters that we need to specify. The first being the message. This is the message that we will use to pass to our HTML page to show the user. I will also format the message using an F string. This will make it easier. In our case, we just want to give a message that says success and it shows their shortened URL. To create the shortened URL, we first need to combine the base URL, which is whatever the domain name is, as well as whatever the unique identifier we have given that particular URL. And we can do it like so. We first need to use the base URL, and then we need to concatenate that with the ID that we have generated for this particular destination URL. So now that we have created a Flash message, we will need to specify within our template how we want to display this Flash message. And something that we can do with Flash messages is to specify a category. This is an optional parameter that we can use when we are trying to render out HTML template. In this case, I will use it as a way of specifying which CSS classes to use. So to receive the flashed messages, we can specify it like this. We first need to enclose it within a bracket and within percentage signs. We will then need to write with messages equals get flashed messages. And then we need to specify a keyword argument of with categories being equals to true. And also note that we need to end all of our statements with something like end with. If it's an if statement, we need to end it with an if. This is just so that Flask knows when that particular statement can stop being executed. And this is how Flask would expect us to write statements that need to be executed within our template. So if it is just two curly braces, that is usually something that is to be displayed to the user, whereas if it has a percentage sign and only one set of curly braces, that is to indicate that it is a statement that needs to be executed rather than something that needs to be shown to the user within the template. And we will see what exactly that means. We will then also need to check if there are any messages once we have received that particular set of flashed messages. And once again, we need to specify that that statement has ended. If there are messages, we will loop over the messages. In our case, we are expecting the message to have both a category and a message. So we can write our for loop like so. And we also need to make sure that we specify when that for loop ends. And for each flash message, we will display it using this div. We will also specify the class as the category variable, which we can do like so. And we will do the same for message. This time we will place it within our span over here. So just to recap a little, we are first receiving all the messages with categories. And if there are messages, then we will look through each message. And for each message, we will use the category of the message as the class. And then we will place the message within the span. So if we save our application and we refresh it, we can see that we now have that message with the styles that we have specified being shown here. And this is what that base URL is. This is the ID that has been generated using the secrets module that we used. And something to note is that the URL is only considered valid if it is absolute. So if it contains the HTTP protocol, which is something like HTTP or HTTPS. So if that isn't specified and the user just enters something like www.google.com, the validators we use actually considers that to be invalid. To get around that, we could use our own custom validator. But just to keep this example short, we will just continue using the one built into WTForms. So that's just something to take note of. So before we go on to create the route that allows the user to use their shortened URL to actually redirect them, I'll first create the unsuccessful message over here. So instead of just printing to the terminal that something has failed, we want to give feedback to the user. And once again, we will use the flash message. Just instead of showing a success message, we will instead show an error message this time. And I'll just print a message of invalid URL, and then I'll give it a class of error and message, which are styles that I've created within the HTML page. So if we save our application and reload the page, we can see that we enter an invalid URL and try to shorten it. It gives an appropriate error message to indicate to the user that they have entered something invalid. Now, what we want to do is to redirect the user dynamically based on the route that they have used on our application. So we will need to first receive the route that they use, and then we need to check it against all of the IDs that we have saved. To do so, we need to use verbal routing in Flask. We can do it like so. We can specify a variable name within angle brackets like so, and we will then receive that variable within our function as an argument. So just to show you what this does, I will return whatever the user has entered within this route so that it is displayed on the web page. So now if we enter a route, this can be anything. Whatever we have entered in the route will be displayed on the web page, since we are using verbal routing and we are receiving the route that the user has used dynamically and then displaying it. So now that we can receive the route dynamically, we will loop over all of the shortened URLs that we have saved, and if it matches with a ID that we have generated before, we will redirect the user to that particular destination URL associated with that ID. And to redirect the user to another URL, we need to import the redirect method from Flask. And I will redirect the user to the destination URL for that ID. And we also need to return this to tell Flask that this is what we want the application to return when the user uses this route. So if we save it and we try using our application now, we can see that we are redirected to whatever URL we initially entered. And you'll probably also notice another problem, which is that if the user enters an ID that does not exist, our application does not return anything, which results in this error. And the way that this is usually handled in most applications is that the user will be redirected to a 404 page. This indicates that the resource is not available on the server. So to do this in Flask, we can first import the abort method from Flask. We will then need to use it, and we can specify an argument of the error code. In this case, we want to use 404, and we need to make sure to return it as well. So if we try using this route again, we can see that the user is just redirected to the 404 page, and it says that the URL is not found on the server, which is what we wanted. And now this application is basically completed. We have all the features we wanted. If we try and add the URL here, we can see that everything works as expected. There are a lot more features you can add, such as probably an account system, or a system where if a URL has already been shortened, it will just give the user the previously generated one. And you'll probably also want to store all the information in the database if that was the case. But this was just a simple application just to showcase certain features of Flask. So that's about it for this video. In a future video, I'll probably show how to host a Flask website for free, so that we can actually publish this website and allow anyone to visit a particular domain and be able to use our website. If that's something you want to see, or you have any other suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Besides that, if you have enjoyed it or if this video has helped you, please consider liking and possibly subscribing to see more of such content and to help my channel grow as well.